Hey, friend. This is part 2 of a conversation with birth researcher and postpartum doula Kelsey Marr. The big idea of parts 1 and 2 of this episode is why are so many new moms struggling with perinatal mood disorders like postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression? And what can we do about this? How can we show up for those new moms in ways that are practical? And how can we prevent the onset of these mood disorders for the people we love and for ourselves? If you haven't listened to part 1, I highly recommend you go back and listen to season 1, episode 7. In part 1, we covered the importance of postpartum planning to support mental health, the role of postpartum doulas in emotional and practical support, and how societal expectations can make it even harder for new moms to succeed when we think we have to do it all. In part 2, we're going to talk about how partners and support systems can better prepare us for postpartum and how we can be part of the support system, the cultural expectations for postpartum mental health, and practical strategies for easing the entry to postpartum, and that it is the rest of your life. In part 1, I also shared about my own postpartum anxiety and depression and intrusive thoughts, which are really stigmatized and really taboo. In part 2, we're going to dig deeper into why we have these biologically. And Kelsey and I dive even deeper into what it really takes to thrive rather than just survive the postpartum chapter of your life. Postpartum can be really challenging for a lot of reasons. And if you've been there, I hope this episode makes you feel very seen and validated. You are not alone in your struggles, and please share it with somebody who might need it right now. Let's get to the episode. I'm Micah Larson, and this is the Modern Hysteria podcast, where I ask guest experts to shine a light on the taboo topics of women's health. Conditions that primarily affect women tend to be under-researched, underdiagnosed, and undertreated, leaving us to wonder if we are the problem. This is real talk, honest. We are here to break the silence around our brains and our bodies, because throughout history, when women spoke up about their pain, they were everything from burned at the stake to lobotomized to called hysterical. This is Modern Hysteria. How can we create a plan to support people postpartum to help avoid some of the common perinatal mood disorders? We're talking postpartum anxiety, postpartum depression. Can you tell us a little bit about what does that look like and how can we plan for supporting people during that?
Yeah. One of the things I love to do with my clients is to start their postpartum planning really early in pregnancy. And it's something that I'm doing during my own pregnancy, even though I'm only 10 weeks along. Especially somebody who has a history of anxiety and depression, we know that you are more likely to experience perinatal mood disorder if you have that history. So either finding that therapist who has the ability to support you during postpartum and your pregnancy, or if you already have a therapist, talking to them about what's coming up during your pregnancy and postpartum. One of the biggest triggers that I find with my clients is actually boundaries. And oftentimes people don't know what their boundaries are until their boundaries have already been crossed. So really taking the time to sit down and think about things like, who do I want to take care of or hold or be around my baby? And how do I want them to be in that space? And I even encourage my clients to journal about it, to write it out, to make a physical plan, and to share that with their support people, so their partner, their family, their friends, before the baby's born. Because that way people already know what the expectations are, and you're not having those discussions when you're in the fog of postpartum. Of course, that looks different depending on everybody's relationships. Having those conversations with your mom might look different than having those conversations with my mom. But that's also where I find that having something written is really helpful, because you can refer back to it and give that back to people. And then I think too, like having those conversations with your partner ahead of time. I know my partner and I are already at this point in our pregnancy talking about how we want to handle night feeds, how we want to handle who's cooking, how we want to handle who's doing laundry, what his parental leave will look like versus my parental leave. Because I think what most of us, before we have kids, aren't prepared for is the fact that this transition isn't 3 weeks long or 6 weeks long. It's really the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
It really, like, you aren't going to be in the fog of the newborn stage for the rest of your life, but this is literally shifting the rest of your life. And so things like expecting the birthing person to do every night overnight alone just isn't really a physiological or emotional reality. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the way to keep ourselves healthy or safe, or to keep that baby healthy or safe. So what conversations, although they might be hard, what conversations can we have early on so that we're really developing a conscientious plan rather than
Mm.
just like a quick list of ideas?
I love the idea of writing it down
Mm-hmm.
so that it's concrete. We can refer to it. You can share it.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be static, too, right? Like, my current plan is to breastfeed my child. I don't know if that's actually going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know if I'm going to like it. I know I'm a fairly low touch person, so maybe I'm not going to be able to handle it. All sorts of issues or plans can come up. And a plan shifting doesn't mean that you've had a failure. It means you've got more information, you have different data than you planned with. And so now the plan changes.
Yes. When we're in those moments where we're having a tough conversation, especially newly postpartum, when, man, I know I felt so emotional,
Mm-hmm.
brain fog, that a plan written out could be a good scapegoat, for lack of a better word. You could point back to the plan and be like, this was, something that we decided upon, and could really help with a lot of uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah. I also love the idea of having a scapegoat. I tell my clients to use me as their scapegoat all the time in difficult conversations with um, family members. So if it's something like, some family member wants to come over and hold the baby, I tell them to throw me under the bus and say, oh no, my doula said XYZ. That's why I have to do this thing I actually want to do. And sometimes, like, depending on your family dynamics, depending on the dynamics within your community, having that person that is there as sort of an expert can be a handy tip too.
And that strikes me how hard of a time it is to struggle with boundaries and, at least for me, people pleasing behaviors, because it's like when you're already spread thin, especially if you don't
Mm-hmm.
have adequate support, that it takes a lot of energy to think about, and state those boundaries
Yeah.
and stick to them and like have those hard conversations, even if it is just with your partner. I was so anxious beyond normal levels of anxiety after my son was born that I told my husband, okay, I'm going to just do all of the night feeding, like
Mm-hmm.
period. And I did for at least 6 months because I was so convinced that he was going to be too tired to do his job, which
Mm-hmm.
he is a physician. It makes sense. Like, I was trying to protect his sleep, and I did do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was convinced that he was going to die in a car crash while he was driving because he was too tired. And our son was born prematurely, and he had to be fed, every 2 hours and pumping in the night and all these things. And then I was so hard on myself when I was suffering. And I wish I could go back and say, this is not a you problem. This is like
No,
a systemic problem.
it's a systemic problem where your partner should not have had to go back as soon as he had so that you would have had support overnight. We should have community where there's people, whether they're grandparents or aunts and uncles or or friends, like it should be normal practice to be there for somebody after they've given birth and help carry that load overnight or help carry the load during the day. So at least if you're up all night, you can sleep during the day.
Yeah, because the common wisdom is really sleep when your baby sleeps. And that's not an adequate blanket statement, especially if you have a baby who doesn't sleep.
Exactly.
And you're caring for other people. And so we mentioned postpartum anxiety. I think, at least when I had my son almost 6 years ago, I knew there were baby blues.
So a perinatal mood disorder is any sort of mood or anxiety disorder that happens during pregnancy, or clinically it's defined as the first year postpartum, but we know that these things can last a lot longer than just that first year. It can feel like things like feeling intense anger or irritability, having trouble falling asleep, trouble concentrating, trouble making decisions, withdrawing, having negative feelings about the baby, lacking energy. It's really the same sorts of symptoms that we see with depression or anxiety or psychosis, but they're specifically relating to this transition in pregnancy and postpartum. And I think a really important distinction to make is that postpartum just literally means the period in your life after having a baby. Postpartum itself does not inherently mean that you have any of these mood disorders or anxieties. I see a lot online where like postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety just gets called postpartum. And those are two different things. Like the baby blues are specifically like a feeling of downness, moodiness, tearfulness, emotionality, and it relates to the hormonal changes after giving birth. But those feelings, which are normal and are common, are only going to last a few days to a few weeks, where we start seeing things like you're feeling these feelings for an extended period of time, you are physically feeling anxiety, you are seeing things or feeling paranoid. Those are when we're really talking about perinatal mood disorders. If a client is experiencing the baby blues, I would help them cope and give them strategies. I wouldn't refer them necessarily to a mental health specialist.
This is Micah with a quick aside about the baby blues. What we call the baby blues, as Kelsey mentioned, are like feeling teary and emotional and kind of cranky in the weeks to the month after childbirth. But baby blues are not a chronic issue like postpartum depression in that they go away within a couple days, maybe a week. Postpartum depression might be long-term feelings of feeling depressed most days or every day, feeling shame or guilt or like you're a failure or a bad mom, panic, fear, having severe mood swings. And now research suggests that some women are actually born with a hormone-sensitive phenotype, which means they're just more sensitive to hormone changes in their bodies that might trigger these perinatal mood disorders. But we know there are also other layers here, like if you already had OCD before you got pregnant, or if you have a history of trauma, those things may make it more likely that you develop PPD, or that when you're postpartum, it exacerbates those existing health challenges. Back to the episode.
If a client is suffering with psychosis or depression or anxiety, I would refer immediately to a mental health specialist because that's something much deeper.
How powerful it must feel to have someone like you in this situation saying, what's normal, what's not normal. Like, this is something we need to call in a professional to help you with this, rather than, having highs and lows in that postpartum period. For me, it was like 13 months of intense postpartum mood disorders. And I thought, what, this was supposed to go away by like 6 weeks, right? But having someone to tell you, no, this is a legitimate issue. This is not something that we can just like grit our way through.
Well, and if you were up every night with your preterm baby and not sleeping and then doing things during the day and beating yourself up about it, and you're transitioning to parenthood for the first time, everything is new, you're learning everything. Why wouldn't you feel anxious and depressed? Like all of that is huge to carry at one time. What I wish is that more people had somebody who lets them know that they don't have to carry that by themselves. You don't have to feel that way postpartum.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for your clients, that's you.
Yeah. Oftentimes it's me. Or, I mean, it's an ongoing conversation, right? Like doing mental health support, being a therapist or a counselor isn't in my scope of practice. But I know a lot of amazing perinatal therapists who I'm more than happy to put my clients in contact with. And for anything that's not falling in that spectrum of perinatal mood disorders, then I'm happy to sit and talk and listen.
Micah here again to highlight an often overlooked perinatal mood disorder, postpartum anxiety, which I think is often eclipsed by postpartum depression, but it still affects a lot of new mothers. Like postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety can be triggered by hormonal changes after birth or after weaning off breastfeeding, as well as very real stressors in life, like your baby's health or financial concerns. Women with a history of anxiety or pregnancy loss are actually at a higher risk of developing postpartum anxiety. I didn't know that when I got pregnant with my son about 5 months after having a miscarriage. Kelsey, too, has experienced pregnancy loss that she says contributes to her anxiety about her current pregnancy. And when we already live with chronic anxiety, even if it's medicated or treated, it can be exacerbated by those hormone shifts after pregnancy, like this big drop in estrogen and progesterone that really affect our brains and our bodies. So what does postpartum anxiety look like? Excessive worry, panic attacks with physical symptoms like a racing heart, dizziness, and intrusive obsessive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are one of those really common symptoms reported by people who experience postpartum anxiety. We talked about this a little bit in part 1. The intrusive thoughts we experience postpartum are thought to be triggered by that drop in estrogen and progesterone after childbirth and after you stop lactating. But when you're with your newborn baby, you can also naturally just be on high alert, and it can turn into hypervigilance, which manifests as those wild thoughts we talked about in part 1. Postpartum anxiety and intrusive thoughts do not mean that you are going to harm your baby. They may also occur more in women who experienced traumatic childbirth, like we discussed in season 1, episode 6. In the last couple years, we've had a little more of a public conversation about postpartum psychosis, especially after Lindsay Clancy, a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, who was newly postpartum, asked her husband to go to CVS and attempted, in his absence, to kill her 3 children and herself. Like a lot of other moms struggling with PMDs, Lindsay gave no immediate signs that she was a danger to anyone or herself. Postpartum psychosis is more rare than the other PMDs. We talked about postpartum depression and anxiety. 1 in 7 women experience depression, but 1 or 2 in 1,000 women experiences postpartum psychosis. And Lindsay Clancy has been portrayed as a monster. Many people may think, I could never do what she did, but it can be especially hard to recognize. It can even start 12 weeks after childbirth. Signs of postpartum psychosis include insomnia, dramatic mood swings, delusions, hallucinations, irritability, aggression, depression, lack of interest in things you usually enjoy, difficulty concentrating, hopelessness, extreme guilt, and shame. Even mania or like excessive energy without feeling like you need to sleep or rest. Sometimes bizarre behavior toward child or other people. So what can we do about the onset of these perinatal mood disorders? According to experts at the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center, in line with what we're talking about with Kelsey in this episode, get enough sleep, ask for help with daily chores and tasks, take time out for yourself, reduce stress, and don't try to do everything yourself. All things that would be easier if you have someone like Kelsey, a postpartum doula, in your life to help you protect your wellness and your boundaries. Okay, back to the episode. Just having someone to hear,
Exactly,
this is what's going on, and tell you whether it's in the scope of normal. I use that word very loosely, but
yeah, I mean, normal has that connotation of like normal is good, but that's not the way we're using it here. We mean like common. It is common to feel this way. It's normal in that, like, lots of people feel this way, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily normal in the way that it's what you have to feel or there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah. How do you think our culture and the way that we view moms and the expectations that we have for moms and birth givers, how do you think that contributes to what we're seeing in perinatal mood disorders?
So I did some poking around this morning because I was really interested to see what the rates of perinatal mood disorders in the United States looked like versus Sweden. Because we know in Sweden they have paid parental leave. Their paid parental leave system is gorgeous. And we lived there for 6 years. And I'm still wondering why we came back to Canada because I don't get to have a Swedish parental leave. They have parental leave, they have access to childcare and all of that stuff. And all of that is really important. But when you look at the rates of perinatal mood disorders specifically as a postpartum outcome, the rates of the United States and Canada and Sweden are all comparable.
Wow.
So, which surprised me. I figured, wow, if they have better paid parental leave and they have access to childcare and stuff, maybe people aren't experiencing postpartum depression to such an extent as they are in the United States. And while all of these conditions are very much multifaceted and there's a lot of different layers involved, I do think that speaks to ways in which the issues that we're facing as people who have just given birth are not just about having time off. They're not just about our work expectations. They're not just about whether or not we have access to healthcare or childcare or what have you. They're also about the way our communities are shaped, right?
Mm.
About who gets what type of support immediately within their home. And one of the biggest indicators actually for lower rates of postpartum depression isn't having the dad or the partner have paid parental leave. It's having their involvement in looking after that kid within the first months of that child's life. So if we were to change the system so that it wasn't so much about paid maternity leave, but it was about opportunities for both parents to parent equally, to be equally involved, to carry an equal amount of the load those first weeks and months, I think we would see a lot better outcomes postpartum on so many different levels.
That is such an important insight, especially when we consider what can we do for people who are planning to get pregnant or are pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to mitigate the risk of perinatal mood disorders as we plan for postpartum?
Yeah.
What can we do?
I mean, there's making sure that you and your partner are on the same page in terms of what life is going to look like after that baby comes. There's so many other things like building healthy habits now around exercise and nutrition, lowering lifestyle stress, lifehood stress is a huge factor in postpartum depression. So I know something that I do with my clients and with myself is start in early pregnancy, making a no list. Like, no, I will be saying no to this during my pregnancy. I will not be taking on new projects. Or after my baby comes, I will be saying no to all of these things. And really thinking through how we can let go some of the extra stuff that we carry with us every day that we don't necessarily need to carry. And I do think if you have access to professionals within the related birth space, making contact with those people while you're pregnant and before you have real need of their services makes it a lot easier to then ask for their help when you need them. So if that's a lactation consultant or a mental health therapist or a pelvic physio, any of these kind of expected issues that people run into postpartum, if we can make contact with those people beforehand, then it's a lot easier to get out the door to talk to them when we actually need them.
Yeah, that makes sense because the hardest time to establish that stuff is like when you just
Right?
had a baby.
Yep. If you're like up all night because your baby won't latch and your boobs hurt and you don't know how to breastfeed and everything, do you really want to take the energy to figure out which lactation consultant is going to work best for you? Or
Yeah.
like if you know somebody already, it's a lot easier to call them and ask them for help.
Yeah, absolutely. When my son was 6 months old, we went back to visit my family in Germany. And then we went to Denmark. And I had already been in and out of the emergency room with chronic mastitis. And I was so sold on the idea that I must breastfeed my child. He was a preemie. He needs my breast milk. I will do it at any cost to myself. And so I was like in and out of the emergency department in the United States, like revolving door. And then my breast pump blew up in Germany because I just like mental
No.
fog. I like plugged it into
Plugged
the
it
wall
in.
socket. And so I got mastitis again when I was in Denmark. And wow, it was a really different experience going to the emergency room there. A week before we left for that trip, I was getting septic from mastitis and I was out of my mind. I tried to leap out of the car on the highway, like on the way there. And we didn't even really figure out that it was mastitis when I was here in the emergency room. And when I got to Denmark, you just walk in to the hospital. They put you right into an exam room with a doctor who just sits down and looks at you in the eyes and is like, what's going on? Does an exam. You like pay when you leave. And there was no wait. And I have had incredible healthcare providers here in the United States as well. But the culture around it is so different. Walking around Denmark with my 6-month-old, everything is set up for
Families.
moms. Yes, everybody just takes their baby out in a stroller, no matter how cold it is. It's like, whoa, it was very stark to be in Germany and Denmark, 6 months postpartum and going through those things. Like, this doesn't feel like how we're raw dogging it in America.
Yeah. I know. We've been talking about like, did we just like pack up and despite the fact that we just moved back to Canada like 18 months ago, did we just pack up and move back to Sweden? Because this, I'm circling my belly, this is going to be a whole lot more fun in Sweden than it will be here.
Yeah,
but
that totally makes sense. The systems are set up differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kelsey, I want to ask one more question. How can we, if we are friend, family, loved one of someone who's pregnant, newly postpartum, how can we show up for them in meaningful, actionable ways without adding stress? It can be sometimes so hard, especially if you aren't a mom, to know how do you show up for a mom.
Yeah, and I get that. And I think it really does depend on your relationship with the person, of course. Like, for instance, my sister-in-law is also expecting, and I'm not going to walk into my sister-in-law's house and just like start doing things the way I do in my client's house. But at the same time, what it really comes down to is asking people what their boundaries are. Oftentimes when we ask people like, how can I help you? Or what can I do for you? It triggers that feeling of like, oh, I have to do everything myself and I can't let people in. I can't let people see that I'm not doing this well for myself. And so when I start with a new family or a new client, I ask what their boundaries are. Like, are there rooms you don't want me to go into? Does it feel weird if I make your bed? Does it feel weird if I cook in your kitchen? Whatever. Each family has their own boundaries. And then I just do the things that I see need doing. If they haven't stated that it's a boundary to cook in their kitchen, I will just walk into their kitchen and make them a meal out of what's in their fridge, right? If they haven't stated that it's a boundary for me to vacuum and I can see that the vacuuming needs to be done, then I will just go and vacuum. Because oftentimes it is a lot easier to accept help, provided that help isn't crossing a boundary, than it is to ask for help.
Oh, yes, that's so true. Yeah. Even because we don't even know sometimes what to ask. There are so many barriers to our asking for help. People pleasing, thinking we need to do it on our own, our like ego, our relationships.
Feeling weird about just asking your friends and family to do things for you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I also understand, like I said, it has to do with your particular relationship with the person. But if it's your neighbor down the street and know that your neighbor's having a baby, maybe just cook them a meal and drop it off. And particularly if you do it after the first 3 months, that's when everybody else has usually kind of this, people are very hands-on in the first few weeks after baby's born, and then suddenly they go back to their own lives and the new parents are left on their own trying to figure things out. They're in the depths of things. If you know that your neighbor down the street had a baby 4 months ago, go drop off a meal. Go knock on her door and see if she needs to talk. Go offer, if they have older kids, offer to take their older kids to the park so that mom can have a sleep. Like, I think part of what we really need in that period is like the sustained help, not just the help in like the immediate after birth time.
Wow. Yes, because like you said, we are postpartum forever after.
Forever after.
And we have this weird 6-week marker for things like, oh, well, you can have sex after 6 weeks. You have your 6-week postpartum checkup or whatever. And sometimes we do call it the 4th trimester, but it really is like,
the rest of your life.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to change throughout, right? It'll change if you have more kids. It'll change the older that your kids get. But your body, your mentality, your emotional state is forever changed after having a baby. You are forever in a different journey than you were before you had your first baby.
Yeah. Well, from one of my 70 months postpartum mom to somebody who's 10 weeks into like this, Kelsey, I can't tell you how powerful it is and really healing and like redemptive it is to hear what you offer, the wisdom, the stability for moms and birth givers who are moving through this process. Like, here we go again. It's really incredibly powerful because it's a totally different way of approaching it, and how lovely it would be to move through that really tender stage of becoming a mom without the isolation and the loneliness and the confusion and the pain. And so on behalf of moms who didn't get that, like, thank you.
It is wholeheartedly my pleasure. And I wish that this was just normal. I wish that what I was doing wasn't exceptional or necessary. But this is where we are right now. And I think the best we can do is really recognizing how we can support each other. And it doesn't need to be a formalized thing, and it doesn't need to be a big thing. It's just one step at a time, knocking on the door with one meal.
Yeah. And visibility is so much a part of the beginning of that, just knowing. So whether, listener, you're listening to this because you found it on Spotify or you saw me or Kelsey on social media, I'm so glad that you saw this and heard this, because just knowing that postpartum doulas exist, that this saying the quiet part out loud about postpartum is so important. Kelsey, I am wondering if we may ask you what is in your bag. Your bag is going to change quite a lot in the next year.
Next little while? Yeah, I think so. So my doula bag is here. I have this really cool knitted boob that I use to help teach moms about lactation and latching. And it's just really fun because it's super funky colors. So this goes everywhere with me because you never know when somebody's going to have a latching or positioning question.
Yes. I like that is the color to denote like the areola and important parts. Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
The actual nipple is right there, and then the areola is there. And it's this color because that was the yarn that was in my knitting basket the day I made it. So,
you made it. Oh, that makes it even
that
cooler.
one I just made. Yeah.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
So obviously knitted boob, have to have. Love. I want that now. And it looks like a piece of art. Anything else that you never leave the house without?
I never leave the house without earplugs. Actually, my mother-in-law is a retired pediatrician. And it was a piece of advice she gave me back before I started doing doula work. She said that her best piece of advice for new parents was always to have earplugs on hand because kids make a lot of noise and it takes a mental toll. So I have a set of earplugs that I wear them to sleep every night. And it cuts out the sound of like my cat or my partner snoring or whatever. But if there's a baby around, I can still hear the baby through the earplugs.
Yes. So wise.
I wear earplugs like all over the place. If you just need a quiet moment, it helps a lot. Personally, I find it helps a lot with just like regulating my body and my mental space.
Oh, okay. Kelsey, I love that. Thank you for the permission to wear earplugs, and we should all put them in our bags, I think.
Right?
I can't thank you enough for being here today, Kelsey. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
This has just been like such a fabulous conversation, and I've enjoyed it so much. I'm so excited to see what the next year brings, because like already 10 weeks in, this experience has not been what I expected it to be. But just we're going to keep learning as we go, because that's all that this experience is, right? Whether it's pregnancy, postpartum, or parenting, mothering, it's just learning one step at a time.
What has not been what you expected?
I knew what all the physical symptoms of pregnancy were. I did not expect the toll it would take to feel it in my own body.
Yeah. Oh, that's one of those things that no one can prepare you for, right? Yeah.
Like I knew pregnancy fatigue was a thing. I did not expect to actually need to take 2 naps a day. Like it was non-negotiable for about 3 weeks. And we have had a previous loss right before we conceived this pregnancy. And so I did not expect, despite having done work in loss and infertility before, I didn't expect how much the mental impact of that loss would affect my experience of this pregnancy.
That is so real. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Oh, it adds a layer of, at least for me, worry and
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just insecurity.
Thank you for putting that into words for so many people who have experienced that or are experiencing that, and for being so open with where you are in your journey. Thank you for your valuable time, and I want to let you go so you can take a nap or whatever it is that your body's asking for, because we have all these new demands when we're pregnant from our bodies. Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Huge thanks again to Dr. Kelsey Marr for sharing her professional insights as a postpartum doula, as a birth researcher, and also her personal journey through their pregnancy. Thank you for tuning in and engaging with such an important topic so we can break this taboo together about postpartum mental health. Quick recap of Season 1, Episode 8. It is so important to set boundaries and plan ahead during your pregnancy for postpartum. Community and professional support can make a huge difference, especially if it's sustained care for you in your postpartum time. And there are very practical and actionable ways we can show up for newly postpartum parents without adding to their stress. Postpartum planning is not just about baby gear. It's really about building that support system and finding people who will be there to hold you during that time in your life. Again, you are not alone. If you had a postpartum experience like I did, it is okay to ask for support. A reminder, I'm still giving myself, whether you're in the thick of it right now or preparing for postpartum, support is out there and you deserve it. If you like this episode, please consider sharing it with someone who might really need to hear it. Leave a review or a rating if you're in the Spotify app, or a comment if you are listening on Substack, so we can help other folks find this podcast. Visit the show notes for links and resources, and to follow Kelsey at Collective Care HFX. I'm so excited to bring you our next episodes. Season 1, Episode 9 with Lucy Rowett, a certified sex coach. We're going to talk about people-pleasing, burnout, and what that means for your libido, and if we should even be using that word in the first place. Season 1, Episode 10 is an interview with therapist Grace Bithell. We are going to talk about CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and shame, and what that looks like, how it shows up in our lives as we try to parent or reparent our inner child. Thank you for listening. This is Modern Hysteria.